Section 24 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 16, Henry's Last French War, Close and Results of the Reign, 1541, Part 2. At his death, Henry left the Church still under the 6 Articles, though procedure according to them had on purpose been made more difficult. Its position had also been defined by the necessary doctrine and erudition of a Christian man, generally called the King's Book, which was printed for the first time in 1544, having been accepted by the Parliament in the previous year. Many of its statements are, as we might expect, more Roman in tone than those of its predecessor, the Bishop's Book. But fortunately for the Church, there had grown up besides these formularies something of far better omen for the future. Erasmus had adopted in the years from 1516 to 1535 the bold course of publishing successive editions of the Greek Testament, based upon, in great part though not entirely, the evidence of manuscripts. This was in effect a declaration that St. Jerome's Latin translation, generally called the Vulgate, had not really the final and conclusive authority ascribed to it by the Roman Church. His paraphrases also set the good example of explaining all passages with their full context, instead of taking a verse here and there and drawing random inferences from it, in the manner of which we have seen an example in the discussion on the exemption of the clergy from the civil courts. Moreover, the Bible had, as we have seen, been twice translated, and though Tyndale suffered martyrdom at Vilvoorde, and the circulation of the English Bible was fenced about with many restrictions and sometimes nearly stopped, it had still been publicly declared to be the only touchstone of true learning. The Lord's Prayer and the 10 Commandments had been taught in English since 1539. In 1543 and 1544, English litanies were used by authority, and Cranmer also translated the Te Deum and other hymns in order that all such as were ignorant of any strange or foreign speech might have what to pray in their own familiar and acquainted tongue with fruit and understanding. Thus everything was ready for the great work of Edward's first years, the drawing up of the Book of Common Prayer in a form like that which we still have, though in some points nearer to that now used by the Episcopal churches in Scotland and America. Roman Catholic writers have constantly assumed not only that these formularies are heretical, but that the effect of Henry's ordinances has been to enslave the Church of England to the state. The former of these points can hardly be discussed in a work like the present. On the latter, it will be enough to remark once more that at the time it was absolutely necessary to check the use by the clergy of their independent powers. It deeply concerned the very being of religion in England that priests should neither kill their parishioners for Christ's sake, nor plot against their property, nor claim immunity from crime as a privilege of their order. Hardly anything, indeed, could be more violent and therefore more anti-Christian than their attempts to compel belief by penalties. It cannot be doubted that Henry's Parliament did rightly in depriving them of powers so much misused, nor has anything since occurred to make us wish the changes undone. It has been well that the sturdy sense of Parliament should have to be persuaded before religious changes could be made. Well, too, at least in times when the people have cared for religion, that bishops should be chosen, not according to the narrow standard of purely clerical electors, but by a minister of the crown who, with every reason both of feeling and interest to select wise and practical men for the office, can also resist currents of temporary church feeling, and in some degree see events as history will see them. Under no other institutions, perhaps, would the Church, by losing step by step all compulsory powers, have been so wholesomely trained and so perpetually encouraged to rely on persuasion only. thus gaining a strength which she never could have dreamed of in her masterful days. And although agitation has sometimes been created in our own time by the sentences of certain civil courts in church questions, yet such judgments have been generally acquiesced in when the immediate stir has been over, and found not in any way to lower the Church or to fetter her development. It would be hard to point to any one good thing desired by the Church which has been hindered by her relations to the State, or to any evil thing to which they have given a longer life. If uncorrected abuses still exist, we may be sure that they remain so because members of the Church have not yet made up their minds that they are intolerable, and not because, the law being what it is, such things must needs live on to vex us, however much we may dislike them. The laws affecting religion occupy so large a space in this reign that those on civil matters are apt to escape notice, though many of them well deserve to be remembered. Such were those affecting beggars, who, if really impotent, were to have written leave to ask alms in a specified district, if whole and mighty in body, were to be whipped the first time they begged and sent home to their own parish, where by another law the overseers were bound to employ them. If any such person offended a second time, the gristle of his ear was to be cut off, besides a whipping, and for a third offence he was to die as an enemy of the Commonwealth. On the same principle of hatred to people with no visible livelihood, all gipsies were in 1530 sent out of the country. Another kind of poverty which the age could not tolerate was that of the poor and broken bankrupt. It was held that the crime and its name were both of foreign growth, and the surrender of all the insolvent's property would never give him a discharge till the last farthing was paid. An Act of 1546 repealed the old laws of usury, allowing interest to be charged up to 10%. New felonies were created under Henry VIII as quickly and easily as when Burke made his celebrated protest against them. It became felony to cut dykes in Norfolk or the Isle of Ely, to sell horses to Scotchmen, to poach fish between 6 in the evening and 6 in the morning, to come masked into a royal park in order to kill deer, to steal young hawks or peacocks, or to burn any frame of timber prepared for building a house. New treasons were still more profusely invented, going far beyond the old definition of Edward III, which almost limited the crime to the 3 cases of levying war against the king, compassing his death, or adhering to his enemies. For Henry's Parliament declared at different times that those were traitors who took, judged, or believed the marriages with Catherine of Aragon or Anne of Cleves to have been valid, who impugned the marriage with Anne Boleyn, who called the king a heretic, schismatic, or usurper, who married any of the king's family without his permission, who married the king himself without revealing past lapses, or who disobeyed any royal proclamation and then escaped from the kingdom. Lastly, in one peculiar case, such a law was ex post facto. A cook named Rouse had tried to poison his master, the Bishop of Rochester, and caused the death of 2 persons. Such acts were therefore made treasonable by a general law, which mentioned him by name and sentenced him to be boiled to death. If from the laws against crime we pass on to the manner in which the courts administered them, it is too plain that hardly any sound principles of justice were known or thought of. Else how could it have been that hardly any prisoners of state were ever acquitted? Experience has taught us that evidence is generally worthless unless cross-examined, but rarely indeed had an accused person any such chance then, not to mention that the bad habit of prosecuting not for the crime, but for just so much as would bring the accused under the letter of the law, must have destroyed the chances of showing discrepancy in the evidence, which would have been if the witnesses had been forced to state all they knew. Of course, a government which so administers justice must be cynically indifferent to one of its prime duties, that of showing unmistakably to all men, even to the culprit himself, that if the law strikes him, it is because he has thoroughly deserved it. Not all Englishmen of the time had Cromwell's Italian unscrupulousness, learned, as he himself said, from Machiavelli, as to the means by which his ends were to be accomplished. But it is not the less true that such outrages on justice introduced into the national temper a mixture of cruelty and hypocrisy which it took centuries to eradicate. The barrenness of the last reign in the field of literature still continued, as is natural in a time when religious controversy fills all men's minds. Indeed, popular poetry was far better represented in Scotland, which the Reformation had barely yet reached, by the really beautiful poems of Dunbar and Gawain Douglas, the translator of Virgil, than by anything which England had to show at the same time. In Dunbar's Timor mortis conturbit me, we see here and there that Shakespeare has been beforehand with us in admiring him, as in the graceful stanza, I see that makers, poets among the lave, plays here their pageants, sin goes to grave. Spared is not their faculty, timor mortis conturbit me. He fully deserves to be called, as he is by Professor Morley, the best English poet since the days of Chaucer. His charming, without gladness avails no treasure, is even alone sufficient to prove this. Gawain Douglas, who was Bishop of Dunkeld under Margaret of Scotland, manages skilfully enough in his King Heart a stanza something like Ariosto's, and his allegorical treatment seems to have given many hints to Spenser. Sir David Lindsay's verse, as Walter Scott said, still has charms. His poem of Jock up a Land ends with a fervent prayer that James V may be strong enough to ding those money kings adoon, who are making Scotland so miserable. And when James freed himself from his guardians, Sir David was not backward in poetically teaching him the real meaning of liberty. In England, the palm of satiric verse — it can hardly be called poetry — was borne by Skelton, who left off mocking at the great cardinal only when obliged in 1528 to take sanctuary at Westminster, and thus avoid his vengeance. His Colin Clout is on the need of reformation in church and state. In Speak Parrot and Why Come Ye Not to Court he makes his bitterest attacks on Wolsey, and in Philip Sparrow he describes with much humour a tender-hearted nun's grief for her lost pet. With Sir Thomas Wyatt and the Earl of Surrey began the refined imitation of Italian poetic forms. In their hands verse seemed to become suddenly modern. They introduced the sonnet in English, and Wyatt at least shows in his renouncing of love that he has gained from Petrarca a real sense of its capabilities. He also, in his poem on the courtier's life, employs Dante's terza rima. Surrey, too, was an inventor in poetry. To him is due the first English blank verse, as used in a translation from the Aeneid. His sonnets, though far less melodious than Milton's, yet have the descriptions of personal character of which the latter poet makes such noble use. This may be seen in Surrey's sonnets on the fair Geraldine and on his faithful follower Richard Clear. The drama was at this time very much in the rough, though it is almost surprising to see how much Shakespeare condescends to borrow from the humours of Udall's Ralph Roisterdoister, which was probably written in this reign. Heywood was also celebrated at the time for interludes, one of the best being The Four Ps, a dialogue between Pardoner, Palmer, Poticary, and Pedlar. The honour of English prose was still sustained chiefly by Sir Thomas More's History of Edward V and by the Utopia. Theologians, however, did much to establish purity of style, especially when they wished to be simple in order to instruct the common people. Cranmer's Institution of a Christian Man is really excellent from its direct and winning expression. and though Hugh Latimer did not much conform to any art canons, yet few Englishmen have ever equalled him in the power of downright preaching, especially on semi-political subjects. Above all, of course, the Bible had been beautiful in Tyndale's translation, and was gradually advancing to that perfection which has won the hearts of revisers in the present day. Scientific study could hardly be said to exist as yet. Men were far more curious to know the Latin and Greek names of natural objects, as Erasmus recommended, than to investigate their properties. Hardly any scientific works appear to have been sold by an Oxford bookseller whose trade diary from 1520 onwards has been preserved. It has been already noted that Linacre, the most truly scientific man of the reign, did not describe the most remarkable diseases of his own time. Indeed, he aimed perhaps wisely at restoring medicine through the works of the ancients, rather than by direct observation, and devoted himself almost entirely to translations from Galen. The science of the day had not yet broken its connection with the occult sciences. Even the earnest and severe Paul III, Pope as he was, never held a consistory or entered upon anything important without consulting the stars. Henry VIII, as we have seen, questioned soothsayers about the sex of his future children with the same faith which afterwards made Charles I send £500 to an astrologer when he was planning his escape from Hampton Court. He also invited to England the celebrated Cornelius Agrippa, whose reputation for magical knowledge was high. Alchemy was in great vogue at Paris, where hundreds of adepts were following each his own system. In England it was less popular, inasmuch as the celebrated Dee, afterwards so favoured by Elizabeth, had to leave Cambridge on beginning to study it. The belief in witchcraft was shown in England by the Statute of 1541 already referred to, but only after popes had been fulminating against it for 50 years, and prosecutions had long been innumerable in France, Germany, and Italy. It is remarkable that the statute made it penal, not in itself, but only if it aimed at destroying life. It is always difficult clearly to discern the everyday character and feeling of people in times long past, yet we are not quite without hints what Englishmen were like in the 16th century. The kindliness and sobriety displayed here in times of pestilence have been noticed above. Akin to the same temper was the general submission to established authority, even when, without the support of any standing army or organized police, it was carrying the most violent changes. Even in the worst times 100 yeomen of the guard were enough to secure Henry's person. Probably the real reason for this obedience was the same dread of renewing civil war, which afterwards made England endure without rebelling the many misdoings of Charles II. Of the social temper of our countrymen in those days there are curiously opposite accounts. A French traveller complains of their hatred for all foreigners, especially his countrymen, of the bad names which they call them, and of the way in which they break their word. A German, on the other hand, cannot say enough of English politeness to the aged and to those whom they consider learned, of their incredible courtesy and friendliness of speech, of the beauty of the ladies, who, he says, never heretic ketzern their faces with paint, and, strangest of all, of the wondrous comfort, civility, and respect which travellers received in English inns. Of course, the relations of English commerce to Germany and France, as described above, may throw much light on these contradictions in statement. Pleasant it would be to look into the interior of more families, and see whether there were many in England where the love of father and daughter was so profound as that between Sir Thomas More and Margaret Roper, and into more meetings of heretics to search for affection like that between Delaber and Garrett in 1528. I besought Garrett, says Delaber, that he for the tender mercies of God would not refuse me, saying that I trusted verily that he which had begun this in me would not forsake me, but give me grace to continue therein unto the end. When he heard me say so, he kissed me, the tears trickling from his eyes, and said to me, The Lord God Almighty grant you so to do, and from henceforth for ever take me for your father, and I will take you for my son in Christ. We need not inquire whether the new beliefs, or indeed the old ones, made men brave. Those who were first to conceive novelties, or who had first to defend old things, might be bewildered by their position, but soon there grew up in both a courage which literally seemed to think nothing of the fire. A slight forcing of language would have saved Lambert's life. Forrest certainly need not have expressed any opinion about Cardinal Fisher's death. Yet both these men determinedly spoke out in spite of the terrors which lay before them, and would not have varied their mode of statement by a hair's breadth to save their life. Some of the reforming party have been blamed for a flippancy and abusiveness before their judges, which made it more difficult to show them any indulgence. Nor can the charge be altogether denied. But then it is beyond most men to die like Latimer, with no harsh word to his persecutors, or like More, with a wish that he and they might find mercy together in a better world. Even if some came short of this, their tongue violence may be condoned, since they were quite as willing to die for their cause as to rail at its enemies. Here, then, this brief summary of 2 reigns must end. It will be for abler hands, with the help of the fresh material which every year now accumulates, to trace the gradual expulsion from our political system of the bad elements of Tudor despotism. To this Henry VIII, in spite of all appearances, contributed both negatively and positively. Negatively, because his striking personality dignified in a manner the violences which he committed and the extravagances which he forced his Parliament to enact, so that subsequent kings of less imposing character were likely to fail in attempting the like. Could his modes of government have been established, they would have been hardly less than a Turkish despotism, but they lived only in the unregulated and despotic spirit which they were intended to gratify, drooped and flagged when he was gone, and by no means uprooted from the minds of Englishmen the remembrance of their ancient liberties. And he also, most unwittingly, but still really, gave our freedom more than one kind of positive help. For his rough and violent hand broke down superstitions, which, though we now regard them tenderly, we should have been sure to denounce if we had lived at the time. He raised up out of the spoils of the monasteries the great and strong middle class which was at length to curb his successors. Above all, his way of referring constantly to Parliament, because he found it servile, and bringing such a variety of affairs under its cognizance, had at least the effect of keeping its powers well in mind against the time when some fortunate election might send up to Westminster a body of members with principles worth having, and a strong determination to make them good against all opposition. He trained Parliament to register his edicts, but the very fact that they had to do so proved their inherent right to dispute them if they would. Therefore, when, as Burke says, new times brought with them new modes of tyranny, it was a light thing for Parliament to use against Elizabeth's monopolies, or James's claim that the sea-coast was his own, or Charles's demand for ship money, the power which had been technically acknowledged in so many various forms, and as applying to affairs so important. In these 2 ways, then, the institutions of Henry VIII have favoured English freedom. End of section 24. Read by Pamela Nagami in Encino, California, May 2022. End of the Early Tudors, Henry VII and Henry VIII, by Charles Edward Moberly.